Hi, can I speak to Brian, please? Hey, Brian, this is Charlie Moss calling you. How are you doing?
Hey, pretty good. I, in fact, just got Star Wars tickets for Thursday the 17th.
I was actually going to apologize because I didn't even think about the premiere of the new trailer tonight. Like,
I don't have ESPN or whatever Monday Night Football airs on, so I can't even watch the trailer.
Okay, yeah, neither do I.
It's all over the internet. I'm not really worried.
Yeah. Nice. So you got.
I don't think I'd be able to buy tickets yet. So.
Well, I feel like the pressure's on because I want to go see it the day it comes out, or even the weekend. But I feel like because the tickets are out so early, like I'm not. I mean, I'm going to try to get them tonight, but I don't. I feel like by the time
who knows if you're going to be even around?
Right.
The thing is, my wife's birthday is on the 18th, and I swore to her I would not see Star Wars on her birthday. But I also know if that's what we have planned for Friday the 18th, so I know I'm not going to be doing anything the day before.
Right.
We're not going to be anywhere. I absolutely can say with all certainty, well, whatever. If not, I eat the $16 or whatever it is. So, like, whatever, I'll live.
Yeah.
Anyway, so perhaps that is a good omen for this interview or something.
Yeah. Well, yeah. My wife's birthday is the 21st, and so I've got to time it around that time. Make sure it's not on that day that I go see the movie.
Yeah.
We're still trying to figure out logistics. But yeah, so let me give you just a little bit of background. So I freelance write kind of on the side from my regular job, and I pitched the Daily Dot. I don't know if you're familiar with that publication. It's just an online news site, and they're actually doing they do a magazine called The Kernel. So like I think every week or every couple of weeks they do like a themed online magazine, and they're doing one for Star Wars in December. So I pitched them on kind of the history of Star Wars action figures, but it's really more what we the angle will be like how Star Wars kind of changed the game for toy collecting. And kind of and I came across your documentary, which I haven't watched yet, but I will because it's completely perfect for this article, which I'm excited about. So,
I will say, given the topic, if you watch the film, that will give you a lot of information on what you are likely to write about, or at least it'll give you a lot of avenues to then jump online and do a little digging, and I can actually give you a couple good sources for information.
Okay.
If that'll help.
Yeah, so. That would be great. I actually interviewed Guz Lopez yesterday.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is prominently in the film. I had dinner with him 2 nights ago.
Nice. Yeah, he said he saw you. He said that he got to see when he was up in New York. So.
Yep.
Cool. Well, let's jump in here. So basically, let's start off with the documentary itself. Like, why? What made you want to make a documentary?
Let me say one thing.
Sure.
If I say anything that contradicts anything Gus has told you, he is probably the right one, not me.
Okay.
just to toss it out there. I say that jokingly, but it's actually, if I say some number or some date and it contradicts something he told you, go with him.
Okay. Good to know. So why a documentary about, Star Wars toys?
Sure. Well, I'm a collector, and I hadn't collected Star Wars toys, and so I hadn't played with them since I was a kid. Played, collected, whatever, and I got back into them, a few years ago, and I'm the type of collector who likes to know everything I can about the stuff I collect. I like to know their background, the stories behind it, the history, sort of where it came from. And it occurred to me two, it's a result of the sort of groundwork the Star Wars toy line laid initially. The whole kind of the shift in the kind of industry, the shift in people's sort of view of toys as a marketing tool, all those things I knew about already, so I knew that there was going to be a strong kind of narrative arc to a documentary about these toys, as opposed to, say, other more modern toy lines.
So why, can you talk about, because I don't know a whole, when I was a kid, we had tons of Star Wars. We still have like a storage room, like a storage rental full of all of our old Star Wars stuff. As far as like general toy collecting goes, I know people have always collected toys, but would you say that Star Wars, especially with the release of the first film and I'll go into a little bit of background as far as the, how the merchandising happened with Lucas's deal, but would you say that Star Wars was like a major shift in the way people collected toys? Like taking it seriously?
So you're talking about years later.
Right.
You're talking about from the 90s onward. Well, it kind of depends on how you're approaching that question.
Okay.
So I'm going to meander through it a little and zero in, and then you tell me where you want me to kind of zero in on. But toy collecting up till that point, I don't want to say up till that point, but certainly when people thought of toy collecting, in a serious way, they were kind of thinking about toys from a much earlier era.
Mm-hmm.
So they sort of think about two different things. One, you had kids who, quote unquote, collected toys. You know what I mean? Which for most kids, not every kid, but for most kids, was probably more just amassing toys. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, when I was a little kid, I certainly collected G.I. Joe. I thought in terms of collecting them, but what that usually meant was I just want to get everything and throw it into my toy chest and play with them. So I collected them in that I was actively pursuing this kind of checkmarked list of figures, but I didn't think about them in terms of value. I didn't keep them in their packaging. It was just more like I want to get them all.
Right. So
when you thought about collecting in a very sort of serious manner, you were really talking about toys of an earlier generation. You were looking at the tin toys from the 50s. You were looking at maybe as late as things like Matt Mason and space toys from the 60s. You're starting to see that. And then going back to the cast iron stuff that in the early 1900s, even earlier. The serious collectors, the guys spending big money, were looking at toys from mid 60s and earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I also collect, besides Star Wars stuff, my really active collection is space toys from the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Oh, cool.
So Buck Rogers, ray guns, things like that, Finn robots. So I actually kind of know, I can actually answer this question a little bit at least, because this is an area that I really focus a lot of my attention. So that stuff, by the 90s, by the early 90s, that's the stuff that was seeing really high prices and whatever. But you're looking at stuff that took place, 40, 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Or previously, rather. I really think Star Wars, if it was not the first kind of very modern toy, very modern action figure to be collected, it was one of them. I'm sure there were collectors going after G.I. Joe stuff at that time in a kind of serious way. And I'm sure there were collectors, because you had a group of kids coming into a certain age by the 90s. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Kids who grew up on these toys who were maybe 10, 11, 12, 13, in that age range, whatever, or younger. By the time the sort of mid-90s rolled around, and you started to see an active market for Star Wars toys, they were early 20s. So maybe they had a job and they had some disposable income, or maybe, they had the wherewithal to track down, all their neighbors who had these toys. And, these kids are like, well, I want them now, so I'm going to get them. Like, I talked to one guy who, even in high school, had this sort of drive, because his dad was into antiques, so he had this sort of mentality in place already. He would start making deals with his friends to get their old Star Wars toys. So he wasn't a kid trying to get these toys to play with. He wanted to recapture all these toys he remembered playing with as a kid, and he saw value in them, personal value. But he also understood maybe now they have a little bit of monetary value, because he started to see them at swap meets or at antique malls and things like that. I can't say for certain that Star Wars was the first, but it certainly was one of them. And I think a big part of that is, out of all these toys that were kind of that particular generation, Star Wars had the biggest kind of property around it, and therefore the strongest sort of emotional and nostalgic and whatever impact on these kids who are now in their 20s, in the 90s, who are in their 20s going after these toys. So what's the toy you have the strongest connection to? Star Wars.
Right. So were you collecting kind of the vintage space toys first, or were you collecting...
Yeah. I'm a little unusual in that I grew up with all these toys in the 80s. I had G.I. Joe, I had Transformers, I had Star Wars, I had He-Man, all that stuff. And I got out of toys for a while and started, I had a band, so I was buying musical gear and recording equipment and all that stuff, in college and whatever. But after college, I started really getting into, I've always been into vintage science fiction, reading stuff from the 40s and 50s, 30s and 40s and 50s. And searching for that stuff introduced me to the toys, and they were prohibitively expensive for me for a long time. But I kind of learned to focus my resources and start collecting that stuff. I'd always been a Star Wars fan, though. That kind of never went away as I got older. But the toys themselves, there's such a headspace where, like, I want vintage toys. And when I say vintage, I mean, like, before I was born.
Right.
The toys that I had, toys that had been around since I was a kid, I was actually kind of, not connecting to because, well, I already know about those. There's nothing to discover. Or so I thought, So it took a long time for me to kind of work my way through the decades and finally hit the 70s and I keep looking at these toys. I keep going to stores where these displays of Star Wars toys, and this was in the maybe 2009, 8, something like that. So it was a couple years before I did the film. So honestly, this was late in the game of Star Wars collecting. I mean, it was already laid out. The maps were there for me to follow. The communities were in place. The online resources were there. Books had been written. So I got into it late in the game. Kind of this rediscovery.
So let me ask you this. Let's go back to your childhood for a minute. So talk to me about the first time you laid eyes on, your first Star Wars action figure or your first Star Wars vehicle. Do you remember what it was?
I can give you early memories.
Okay.
I can't tell you the first time because I was so young. I was born in 75. So Star Wars came out in 77, so the first Star Wars toys came out in 78, early 78. February, March, they started to trickle in for this mail away that was done in 77. I can tell you all about that if you want, but it's kind of revolutionary what they did. But anyway, the toys didn't land on the store shelves until probably March or April. So I was 78, so I was 3. My birthday was in April, so I was really young. So I can only imagine that my parents must have something made me aware of these things, but I don't remember what it was. But I do remember really early memories of it. I remember sitting in my living room as a little kid this really early toy called the Imperial Troop Transporter.
Mm-hmm.
The vehicle that didn't even appear in the movie. But as a little kid, I didn't know. It just didn't even register. And I thought it was the coolest toy. It's still one of my favorite Star Wars toys. Because it had these little buttons. Press little buttons, and inside is a tiny record.
Yeah.
And it would then talk.
Yeah, I had that.
Say lines from the movie.
I totally forgot about that.
It was great. Because for me, as a little kid, it's one thing you have an action figure, and it's like, oh, that's kind of like Luke, I guess. But this toy was like having the actors in my living room singing the lines. I mean, that's how it felt to me as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, whatever it was. And that blew me away. And I love that toy. So I remember sitting in my living room, playing with that thing and just being fascinated by it. And interestingly, I now know, it's technology that had been around since the 50s, the Holly Hobby talking dolls, mm-hmm. The cow goes moo, all the same technology. Anyway, and I also remember the Boba Fett mail away. My dad flipped out all the little proofs of purchases and mailed away for the spec figure. And it arrived, and I remember him bringing it upstairs and giving it to me, and just me freaking out. I had no idea who this character was, but it looked super cool. And I was not aware, I don't know if you've heard the whole story, but originally there was supposed to be a rocket firing mechanism.
Right.
They had to cancel it. They never released it. And a lot of kids who were old enough to know this were very disappointed. Mm-hmm. I didn't know any better, so I was just thrilled to have this thing. But I remember the rocket looks like it's supposed to come out. Mm-hmm. It's a separate piece that they weld in there. And mine had teeth marks all over it as I tried to pull this damn thing out of the back of the figure. Because I was convinced it was, because I had other toys where these rockets were removable. So I was like, why is this not coming out? It's driving me nuts as a kid. And of course I never got it out, that's the point. But, so I distinctly remember that. So those are some early memories. I remember playing on my kitchen floor. My best friend at the time, had the Death Star playset.
Oh my god.
And he brought that over, and I remember sitting on our kitchen floor for some reason. I don't know why we played in the kitchen, but whatever. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, but I couldn't understand how it was the Death Star. It was shaped like this giant pie wedge. And not a ball. Like, it didn't make any sense to me. I remember being a little, I don't know if I could be pissed off at that age, but I kind of was.
Yeah.
I was like, what the hell? This is not right. But I still thought it was really cool. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, you and I are right at the same age. I've got a lot of the same memories around the same time. Like, did you get the because we used to do the proof report. I remember we got Anakin, and we had to send off for Anakin. We had to send off for the Emperor, I think. We had, between my cousin Chad and I, we had so many of those action figures, and my other cousin went and sold all of them behind our back at a garage sale, like in the early 90s probably. So we still have all the vehicles and stuff still in storage. We don't have many of the figures left, but yeah, that's
I don't have any of the stuff I had as a kid. I rebought a lot of it when I started collecting. And also, by the time Return of the Jedi came out, which would have been Anakin, and the Emperor and all those, I'd gotten out of Star Wars toys. I was totally into Transformers and G.I. Joe and stuff like that by then, because they're more articulated and just, I still love Star Wars. I mean, I saw Jedi in the theater. I was totally into it. But for some reason, I bought a few of those figures, but, my young eye had been wooed away by all these other toys on the shelves that were coming out, that, of course, had their success in kind of the foundations built by the Star Wars line.
Right.
Which, obviously, I didn't know at all back then.
Yeah.
I had no clue. But yeah.
Well, so can you talk a little bit about, because I read something about that too. Are you familiar, Brian Torney, does he ring a bell to you, his name?
What's his name?
Brian Torney. He works for Hasbro, which bought Kenner, and he wrote this piece online about. It's just a real brief history of the Star Wars action, because that's kind of where this idea came from about pitching it.
I haven't read that. I mean, really the best book. So there are a couple. I think and people seem to be comfortable with it, so I'm cool saying it. I think my movie does a pretty good job of laying out the gist of where it all came from.
Right.
But the real great book is Steve Sansweet. Stephen J. Sansweet, who is the biggest collection in the world, like Guinness certified it. He turned it into a museum. It's like a nonprofit. He gives tours, all this stuff. He wrote a book called From Concept to Screen to Collectible, and that lays out how it went from the idea for the film through the creation of the film, and then how that got then transformed into this kind of marketing thing and the creation of the toys. And he interviewed a lot of the former Kenner guys and stuff. And he kind of laid out the story, and I built, that was the thing that I built my film on. I told him this, we interviewed him in the film, I told him this 100 times, that really reading his book sort of helped me solidify what this thing needs to be. But also Gus, the Star Wars Collector Archive, SWCA.com, is a great resource for this.
Okay.
And KennerCollector.com is a really good one.
Okay.
These are people who have really done the research and really talked to so many people that they've kind of figured out the actual story. But, the gist of it is, Lucasfilm and Fox shopped the idea around to a bunch of toy companies. But at the time, toys and movies were not a safe bet, which is absurd to think about today.
Right.
But the idea was, movies were not in theaters for long enough to serve as a strong advertising element for the toys. It takes so long to produce a toy that the movie would be gone, there'd be nothing to kind of guarantee that the two would act in tandem to bolster each other's sales. Now, on top of it, and it's also impossible to believe today, science fiction as a kid's thing was not a safe bet. Because in the 50s, you had a lot of science fiction for kids. The kids could go see. You had Forbidden Planet, you had Flight to Mars, you had Banger Red Planet, all these great movies. But by the 60s and 70s, you started to get into more kind of thinking man science fiction. You had 2001 in the late 60s, and then in the 70s, you had movies like Silent Running, and Logan's Run, which were all kind of heavy. So kids, it wasn't seen as like this kid's medium, which is just bizarre. And Star Wars changed that on so many levels. So first you had a movie that was unabashedly for children. It was this exciting Buck Rogers-esque adventure. Originally Lucas wanted to license Flash Gordon. He couldn't do it.
Right.
Couldn't get the rights. So he just wrote his own. And that's what Star Wars is. It's totally Flash Gordon. And then, so the toy, so suddenly you have a marketable movie. So it's like, okay, well, we just need to convince the toy companies that this is actually for kids. Then there's this whole problem of the movie won't be there for very long. But everyone passed on it, even if they could convince them that Star Wars was the real deal. Except for Kenner. Kenner was this mid-sized toy company that had success with like the Easy Bake Oven. They had taken over the license for Play-Doh. So they weren't like a no-name brand, but they were small enough where they could actually afford to take the risk. Because in their mind, what do they have to lose? And they figured they'd put out a couple games, like paper products, things that they could produce really quickly, because then this thing would be gone, and that'd be it. Well, a year later, Star Wars was still in the theaters, and Kenner realized, holy crap, this is huge. We have to have toys, like action figures, like anything. We have to have it for Christmas. So, up to that point, Star Wars had won over in the sense that it had proved everyone that this was a thing that could be done. You could have toys with a movie, and with a science fiction movie, and kids wanted it. There's a market there. So it proved everyone wrong on that front. Of course, then they had the problem where they couldn't get any toys done by Christmas because it takes a year to produce them. Star Wars comes out in May, so you got the end of mid-May, you got June, July, August, September, October, November, December. It's 7 months. Impossible. Which takes us to the early bird set, which is the thing that Kenner did to try and get ahead of it. They released an empty box for Christmas. It had some stickers, it had like a little display stand, and it had a mail-away coupon. You fill out the coupon, mail it away, and Kenner swore they would get you toys in the beginning of 1978. And in February, they started to arrive in kids' mailboxes, these 4 action figures and some little kegs so you could put them in the display stands. So, but it took all of that to, like, they had to overcome all those sort of things to get to market. And then from there, it just exploded. And it was, again, the biggest hit in the world. But really, nobody had any confidence. One of the things that made it happen, there's a designer there named Jim Swearingen. He used to work for Kenner in their preliminary design department. And he worked for a guy named Dave Okada. And Okada was the head of that department. And they got a script in. They were always getting scripts for licensing deals because they had $6 Million Man and had a success with that. And, worked for the TV show. They got this movie script in, and Okada gave it to Swearingen and said, hey, you like science fiction, read this. And of course, it was Star Wars, and Swearingen had been a fan of THX 1138, which was Lucas's earlier film. And he's like, yeah, great, I'll read this. He came in the next day and said, you have to read this right now. We have to do this. I interviewed him for the film, and everybody who read it was like, this is the most amazing opportunity to make really cool toys, and to really, sort of push things in new and interesting directions, and they were all really excited about it. And then it became just this monster hit that nobody was ready for. But history, man.
It's amazing to think about that now, which brings me to my last question, and then I will let you go, I promise.
I love talking about this stuff. I'm like Boynard, so whatever. Any questions you have, I'm happy to answer.
I appreciate it. So, what do you think the future is for now that Disney's bought Lucasfilm? And as we see, we had Force Friday, which I went to at Target and all that. And so it's huge now. I mean, it's bigger than it's ever been. And so do you think that will hurt? Like what happens with the comic books in the 90s, where they sold so many comics that the business really started to suffer. Do you think there will be like an oversaturation? Do you think it'll have an effect on toy collecting, or do you think it's just a really good thing?
So there are actually a lot of questions there, sort of wrapped up in your question. There are kind of a lot of different points, and they're all connected. When you talk about toys and toy collecting and the market and all this stuff, you're really talking about two different things. One, people's desire to just have this stuff, whatever it may be, whether it's the action figures, whether it's the soap dishes, whether it's all of it. Then you're talking, the second side of it is the collectibles market, which is very different than the actual kind of industry, the toy industry, that secondary market where things suddenly have all sorts of value.
Right.
So, what happened with comic books was kind of both the actual market and the secondary market got crushed by the bubble in the 90s, because they were overproducing comic books. You had a few companies overproducing product for a market that was buying multiples because they all thought it would be worth something, and then when they discovered it wasn't going to be worth anything, they all stopped buying it, and you had this market kind of collapse in on itself. In this case, you have many different companies holding licenses to Star Wars products. So it's not just Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and a couple other companies that don't exist anymore. Image still exists, but whatever. It's spread way broader than that. So while there might be oversaturation of product, because now, I saw a picture of Yoda grapes. I don't know if it's real or not, but it is certainly representative of reality where anything that can be branded Star Wars is going to be branded Star Wars. The thing is, if some random guy who has the license to produce a Star Wars kite, let's say that X, that's not going to take Hasbro down. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's not going to destroy the market for the toys. So, for the action figures. So it's spread much broader. So I think that, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I would imagine that creates a certain level of insulation in terms of the market. On the other hand, Hasbro might decide to put out so many action figures that a lot of them end up being peg warmers. It's so early in the game, we don't know who's going to be interesting or who's going to be popular or who the kids are going to want. So maybe they overproduce and they end up losing some money there, but I doubt that'll happen. I think they've sort of turned this into a science, and they know how many they produce of the main characters, how many they produce of the others, whatever. The collectible side of things, though, I think learned a very valuable lesson in the 90s when the Power of the Force 2 figures came out, which was kind of the relaunch of Star Wars toys in the mid-90s. And then when the prequels came out, you know, suddenly everyone wanted to rush to buy those. And people went crazy. They bought so much stuff. They were buying like 20 Jar Jar figures, you know, and none of it is worth anything today. They were looking at the vintage stuff and seeing the prices and saying, well, I'm going to get ahead of the curve. The problem is, if everybody is buying everything and then hoarding it, you don't create, there's no rarity.
Right.
And on top of it, nobody had the nostalgia for those 90s figures that they had for the figures growing up. So supply way outweighed demand in that scenario, because demand was barely there and supply was massive. So I think a lot of collectors have learned from that, and now I'm sure there are dudes that, like, I went a couple days after Force Friday. I went Force Friday and just to hang out with some friends. I saw these crazy lines, and I saw the stores get cleaned out, and I was like, whatever. I'm in New York City, so I went back on Sunday, and every shelf was restocked. I could buy anything I wanted. I didn't have to wait online, and it was all very civilized. But I still saw some guy in front of me buy like six of the new, you know, Disney put out these die-cast X-Wings. They're pretty cool, and they're the X-Wings from the new movie, and he bought 6 of them because he was insistent. I heard him talking about this, that they were going to be worth more. And I was like, you don't understand, man. Disney is going to produce these forever until the money stops rolling in. They're not going to be worth anything. The vintage stuff is worth something because people threw it away. You know, it's all hunted down again. So I think that those people have learned that lesson, and we're not going to see a repeat of that. The other thing, though, is lately I've been hearing rumblings on Facebook. People see some of the crazy stuff that got Star Wars emblazoned on it, and they're like, you know, they're sticking Star Wars on everything. This is like getting stupid, and it's really insulting to the fans, and, you know, it's turning me off of this whole thing. And a friend of mine raised a very valid point. He's like, guys, what do you think they did back in 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, and 83? They put Star Wars on everything they could. And it might not have been done as broadly as it was done today because they didn't realize that the licensing opportunities that we see today existed. They put it on everything. There were tape dispensers with C-3PO, like masking tape dispensers. There were things you could buy for your bathroom, you know, like toothbrush holders. There were, I mean, the most insane stuff had licensing on it. So this isn't anything new, and it didn't turn anybody off then. So why is anybody complaining about it now? Yeah. And maybe it's because we're more savvy consumers, you know, and we kind of understand when we're being marketed to. But back then, we just looked at it as they're not taking advantage of us. They're giving us what we want.
Right.
And I think people's attitudes have shifted today, for better or worse. How that'll affect things, I have no idea. But I'm sure we'll see a lot of clunkers. But I don't know. You know, look, I don't collect modern toys. I don't have the room. I don't have the money. I don't have the inclination to keep up with something that is being produced, you know, constantly being expanded upon. It's impossible for me. But I went into Disney and I saw these die-cast figures. They've got these 6-inch tall metal figures. They had the new First Order Trooper, the Flame Trooper. At the time, they had Kylo Ren, and then they had Finn, John Boyega's character. They didn't have any of the others who are out now. And I have to say, they're super cool, so I bought them. But I'm not feeling the sort of pull. Oh, and I bought the remote control BB-8, because that's just the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
It's an amazing toy, an amazing little piece of technology. One other thing. You're sort of approaching this from the point of view of collecting. Mm-hmm. I think that's valid today. But at the same time, you can't lose sight that this stuff is for kids. It's the market, the main market, originally, was for kids. There were no collectors. And a big part of the stuff that we see today that we look at as adults and are like, oh my God, that's the dumbest thing I ever saw. Well, that's not being marketed to you. That's being marketed to some kid. Some 8-year-old is going to look at that and think, I want that. That thing that you made fun of, I want it. So now what we're seeing is a recognition that there are two sort of very solid markets, at least two very solid markets. The collectible market, the older market, the market that is sort of the longtime fan that wants things for their collectible shelves. And then the market for kids. And that's not something we saw previously. So who knows how that'll affect things. You know, it maybe allows a level of diversification that can bring in more money because, you know, Hasbro and Disney and all them can say, well, we got this high-end line where we're going to charge $50 for, and then we got this low-end line where we can charge like, you know, 10. And that might prevent some of that bubble because they can kind of zero in on the people who have the dollars that they want. I really don't know. I don't know. I sort of rambled there. I have no idea if I provided you with anything useful.
No, yeah, you did. No, you were great. You were great. What I'll do is I'll start putting this story together, and I may come back on Facebook with a couple of follow-up questions once I start writing it, and I'll check out the documentary. I've already recommended it to some friends.
Yeah, if you have Amazon Prime, we're on Prime, so you can watch it for free. I don't mind paying for it at all because I mean it's. No. I make money off it no matter what. So it's doing through Prime. So I always tell people if they're not hardcore into this, you know, check it out on Prime.
Okay.
It'll answer some of your questions. And Gus's website, the Star Wars Collector Archive, is just filled with history.
Cool.
It's an amazing site.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no worries. And can you send me is it going to be online or is it going to be?
Yeah, it'll be online. Yeah. So there's the Daily Dot website, but then they also do this.
Sure.
This webazine or whatever called The Kernel, which is just like a theme that's got one common theme and it's got a bunch. They did a superhero story. They did a superhero theme a couple of weeks ago, which was pretty interesting.
Right.
But
do you know when it's running, or do you just know your deadline?
My deadline's at the end of October. It's running. They're going to time it with the release of The Force Awakens, so December.
December.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you remember, you could send me a link to it once it's out. Just in case I totally flake by then, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd love to.
And I'll be sure to share it on our Facebook page. You know, we don't have the Daily Dots numbers, but 5,000 people who dig Star Wars.
Well, and hopefully, hopefully this piece will give you some more traffic for the documentary too. I was really pumped when I found it. So.
Awesome, man. Well, if I can save one journalist, I've done my job.
I appreciate it.
I've been on your side, man. I've spent many years writing for magazines and newspapers, so believe me.
Yeah, well, and I just do this on the side too. If I could afford to do it full time, I would. It just doesn't. It's not the same as it used to be, apparently. So, but well, anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No worries, man.
All right, enjoy talking to you.
You too.
All right, bye.